In this video, I am going to be discussing the life of a pivotal figure in the abolition of slavery in Britain, Olaudah Equiano. Equiano was born in modern-day Nigeria, at the time the Kingdom of Benin, and in his book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa the African, he details how his sister and himself were kidnapped as children from their village while their elders were away, and how they suffered at the hands of their captors. He was then forced to travel through various countries in Africa and was passed through the hands of many masters. He describes the first time he saw a slave ship, and he was terrified and confused. He saw many black people chained together, all expressing dejection and sorrow. And it was at this point where he says, "I no longer doubted my fate," and he describes witnessing all of these slaves being whipped and flogged if they refused to eat. Equiano himself was sold into slavery, where he was shipped briefly to Barbados, and you can just imagine the terror and confusion that he must have experienced, as his first few experiences on slave ships were filled with constant fear that he would be killed and eaten by the white people who had control over him. When he arrived in Barbados, there was initially a sense of wonder as the slaves began to take in this new and unfamiliar land. He highlights seeing that the houses were built with multiple stories and that he was seeing people riding horseback for the first time. Shortly after his arrival in Barbados, Equiano was then moved on to Virginia in the US. Whilst in Virginia, Equiano was bought by a naval captain called Michael Henry Pascal for around 30 or 40 pounds at the time, and Equiano was renamed Gustavus Vassa, which he went by up until releasing his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. Pascal took Equiano to London, and on the journey he was again fearful that he would be killed and eaten, but strangely he was told that blacks were not good to eat, and he was somewhat reassured by the knowledge that he himself would not be the first choice of meal should the merchants resort to cannibalism. The journey to London was a long one. After a 13-week passage, Equiano finally arrived in Guernsey before being moved on to England, where he would live with the Pascal family and was taught to read and write in English. This was in 1757, so he was still only 12 years old at the time. Whilst Pascal was the owner of Equiano, he spent much of his time at sea on naval warships. He describes how his fleet sailed across the coast of France, chasing many vessels, taking 17 prizes. He learned how the ship was manoeuvred, and at one point he was made to fire one of the guns. Now just remember, he's a boy. He's still a boy at this point. He spent his first 2 to 3 years in England technically at sea, and could by now finally understand the conversations that were around him. He was aligned with the customs of those around him, and to an extent he felt British. Equiano goes into great detail about his excursions around Europe, from Gibraltar to Barcelona, and the realities of being in battle on a warship. But in times of peace, he was always keen to learn about these new and interesting cultures. In 1763, Equiano was sold to Captain James Durand, where he was taken to Montserrat and sold to the merchant Robert King. His skills in trading and saving would be crucial over the next 3 years, as he was able to save enough money to buy his own freedom. As a free man, Equiano travelled back to London, where he became a seaman and a captain in his own right, travelling across the Atlantic and even the Arctic Ocean in search of the North Pole. After this, he came into contact with Granville Sharp, who was an anti-slavery campaigner, and this was a pivotal point in Equiano's life. Equiano knew that abolishing the slave trade wasn't something he could do alone, so in 1775 he travelled back to the Caribbean and set up a plantation colony. His goal was to create the best possible environment for those that were still being bought and sold as slaves. But for all his hard work, he was again kidnapped and threatened with his life. He then returned back to London and eventually began working with the Sierra Leone Resettlement Project. This was a project that ensured the safe space for freed slaves to live without fear of being kidnapped and returned into the slave trade. He set up the Sons of Africa, an organisation which aimed to bring about the abolition of slavery by influencing the public consciousness. The Sons of Africa were prolific in their public speaking and lobbying Parliament. In In 1788, Equiano went to the House of Commons to support a bill which would see the conditions of slave ships improve, essentially ensuring that captured slaves would be treated as humans rather than livestock. So, for example, reducing the number of slaves that could be allowed on each ship. In the following year, 1789, he published his autobiography, which quickly became a bestseller. There was clearly an appetite amongst the public for truth and justice. The book begins with an address to Parliament, where he pleads for compassion towards slaves and a need for change. He details the customs of his own culture in Benin, festivals and ceremonies, the importance of music and dance, and just a unified community spirit. He shows a sense of civilization and etiquette which would have surprised many Western readers at the time. He describes the wealth of agriculture that just isn't found in Europe, and he states that cheerfulness and affability are two of the leading characteristics of our nation, in stark contrast to the barbarism and savagery which the British public was sold as the truth. Interestingly, he describes how slavery had already existed within his community, but to a very different degree. The people they called slaves did just about as much work as everybody else in society and lived relatively peaceful lives, and were regarded pretty much as equals. The biggest thing was that they were not permitted to eat with those that were freeborn. So this is a very, very different type of slavery. The book ends with a letter to the Queen, with one final push to abolish slavery. In the book, he also highlights another difference between British culture and that of Benin. In his own community, there was no notion of swearing or vulgar language, and yet Africa was seen as the uncivilized and brutish continent. Equiano would spend the following years relentlessly travelling the length and breadth of Britain, promoting his book through talks and lectures and enforcing the importance of the abolition of slavery, really trying to get his message out to as many people as he possibly could. Equiano passed away in 1797 at the age of 52, and although he didn't live to see the abolition of slavery, his books certainly contributed heavily to it. Just as they did with his earlier work, more and more people began to see slavery from the eyes of those who had been enslaved. They developed a sense of empathy in the community and a pressing need for change. I feel like it was his respect for all of the cultures that he experienced and his eloquence in describing them that really convinced people that the horrors he had also described was something that really needed to change. So that was a brief walkthrough of the life of Olaudah Equiano. He was an amazing man who, like so many, faced extreme adversity and maintained a dignified and staunch attitude towards slavery. Apologies that my camera died in the middle, so there might be a little bit of continuity, but you know, if you're interested in learning more about Equiano's story, I have, as always, included all of my sources in the description for you to go and have a read, and you can go and do your own research, because really your own research is key to this. Remember, we're all learning together. If you're enjoying the content and you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do that right now. You can also check out my other videos, and you can reach out to me on Instagram and Twitter. I am at JRMediaLDN, and I'll see you on the next one.